Morning, everyone. You can hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we'll wait a couple minutes. People are going to show up. Have you all seen the exam schedule? Yes, some yes, some no. We have, the exam has been scheduled. Yours is on October 7th. It's a Wednesday. It's at Tav College. And it starts at 8, goes 8 to 12, 8 in the morning. That's 2 weeks from today. So we have to start thinking about that exam. What we're going to do today is we're going to start looking at Billy Budd. I'm going to ask you to read the first 7 chapters. And in the second half, I do want to touch on some, which should be review for most of you, regarding essay writing. So you can start anticipating what I will be looking for in the exam. Okay, so I have a document that I'll be posting on Omnivox, really laying out the basics of paragraph and essay structure. And we'll go over that briefly. Shouldn't take too long. Again, you've all taken at least 2 English courses before this one, so this should be, you should be familiar with it, but it's just to remind you and to make sure we're all on the same page with that. Okay. Okay, so before we pull up the text, what do we think? What are your reactions to the beginning of Melville's Billy Budd? How'd you find it? Easy?
I found it strange. It wasn't too much wrong with the vocabulary. It's just the way it's written, and that makes me think. Like, it got me very confused with each paragraph. I felt like it was changing so much. Different information sounded like, oh, now we're in this book. Now this guy is changing from being on a merchant ship. We're going to this guy's ship. And this was all over the place for me, especially the beginning chapter.
Yeah, because I mean, we have a couple things going on there, right? We're being introduced to the characters. The main character, which we know is the main character because it's entitled Billy Budd. And he's transferring from one ship to the other. But then we have all that stuff about the mutinies, right? And Admiral Nelson. And it can be a bit confusing. Why is that information and very detailed information about actual events related to the British Navy, related to the war with France. There's a lot packed into those first 4 chapters, 5 chapters, because then in chapters 6 and 7, we're introduced to another character, the captain of the Indomitable, which is the ship that Billy transfers to. What other observations? Anything? What do we know about Billy at this point? Anything. What does he look like? What is he?
He's a handsome young
Mhm.
like guy who works in Navy.
Yeah, we get this because what? How does the story start? I mean, what's the what the? Yes, everyone does like him. Again, you have to remember this is a fairly long text, and as I've told you, as you know, the beginnings of text, pretty much all texts of literature, is laying a foundation. In this case, we're being introduced to characters, and we're getting the setting laid out for us. All right. Um, Billy is handsome. Um, how does he describe his looks? Is that something that you're going to
With
want to get?
his gray handkerchief and his
Yeah,
banana,
yeah, and
muscular a bit.
be attentive that he compares Billy. And this is going to run throughout the whole novella, to mythological characters, biblical characters. And that's very intentional, right? It's almost, who is this Billy Budd? Right? And again, there's a lot of information in these first chapters giving us clues as to some degree, the mystery of Billy Budd. Where does he come from?
He was found on the doorstep.
Yeah, he's a foundling, right? He's asked, who are your parents? His response, God only knows. So he doesn't seem to have a background, right? And again, that's creating a certain sensibility surrounding him. That's going to, and you want that's established now so that you can, as you continue reading, pick up on further of these types of references, suggesting almost to some degree an otherworldliness to Billy Budd. Again, and that really is hammered home to us when we see he's compared to Apollo, ancient Greek statues, refer to related to Adam, from the biblical Adam and Eve, and there'll be more coming, and you want to be very attentive to that, right? And try to figure out, how does that relate to his character development? Is there character development? And to the plot, which we don't have much of yet. I mean, what do we know? What happens in these first chapters in terms of the action of the story? Anyway, just the basics. In terms of Billy.
Billy was taken to another ship, warship,
Right.
and without
Yeah.
the consent of his previous boss.
Okay. So yes. So what is that suggesting to us? What's the difference between these two ships?
And about their activities,
Yeah. What kind of a ship is he on at the beginning? What's it called? What's the name of the ship he's on before he transfers over to the Indomitable?
remember the name.
These are the things you really want to be attentive to. Names are inevitably very important. And we know that because the story emphasizes the name and where the name comes from. Anyone, through the chat, or unmute yourself.
Culture,
Sorry,
Greek sculpture.
the sculpture?
Yeah.
Well, the specific name of the first ship.
Rights of Man.
Rights of Man. Okay, it's important. Where does the name come from?
From him, I don't know, from human rights?
Yes, but it comes from a specific book by a specific author. This is the importance of close reading and taking notes when you read. Even if you don't recognize or are familiar with the reference, you want to take note of this.
I didn't really know what book is of. I just searched it. Is it by Thomas Paine?
Correct. Book he wrote called The Rights of Man. Now, without having to go into the details of the book or too much of the details of the historical context, but we do have to look at that in this book. And we know that because of and we'll talk about it in a bit, the references to the mutinies and the importance of that and when this is taking place. The Rights of Man was happening at a time during the French Revolution when Thomas Paine was writing it. And it is very specifically discussing a dramatic shift in societal attitudes where in a nutshell, the rights of man with a capital M, are being addressed, that there's problems. The French Revolution was very much a rebellion, right, against the status quo. And a big part of that French Revolution, stemming and evolving out of the Enlightenment, was to better society for the individual, right? Where new policy was instituted that attempted, its goal was to create a society that would better the lives of the individuals within that society rather than the often perceived as very oppressive policies that were instituted in France by the monarchy. Okay, and the reverberations of what was going on in France with the revolution and everything that stemmed from that revolution was impacting all of Europe and across the ocean. Right? It was a dramatic shift in Western society, Western civilization. Right? And what the Rights of Man suggests, remember, he's transitioning from one ship to the other, is that it's symbolically representing that kind of individuality where society, where the individual has a certain level of freedom from the societal impositions that were enforced by governments in these societies. The Rights of Man is not a warship, a 74-gun warship like the Indomitable. Okay, and again, symbolically, one is representing the individual rights, and the other is representative, most obviously, of the military and the idea of servitude to the society through military service and others. It's important to keep that in mind as we go through this. There's a conflict being explored in this novella between individual rights and societal obligations. Societal obligations that are imposed, right? Someone brought up that he's taken from one ship to the other, and the captain of the rights of man really has no say in it, right? And he doesn't, because the authority of the Indomitable and what it represents as a military ship gives them the right, societal right, to do whatever they want. I mean, remember in that scene, it's not just that the lieutenant comes and says, okay, I'm taking him. You have no say in it, right? But it's also the way that he treats. He's a lieutenant from the Indomitable, but his interaction with the captain of the rights of man is clearly suggesting that even as a lieutenant, he holds power over the captain of the rights of man, because the Indomitable is a representation of the government of that society, right? And these sailors, Billy Budd has no choice. He's been drafted. He has no choice, and neither does the captain. And how does the captain react? The captain of the rights of man, how does that captain react when the lieutenant wants to take and does take Billy? What does he tell us about Billy that helps us have a better understanding of who Billy is? Okay, think about that. So again, on the chat, I didn't understand why he was taken from his other ship. No, the reason was that the Indomitable, as a warship that is heading out to fight a battle, it needs more sailors so they can indoctrinate anyone onto the ship they choose, anyone who, because the idea of this draft, the Billy Budd is already in a position where he has given up his rights. Ironically, even though he's on the rights of man, they have more freedom than the military, but ultimately they need people on the Indomitable. They can pick and choose whomever they want. Okay, so yes, there is a reason. They need men. And that ties in to the discussions of the mutinies.
Sir, but
Yes.
why Billy Budd in specific?
Well, that's a great question, right? Why does he only picks Billy? Why is he only picking Billy? What does the captain of the rights of man say about Billy?
He was the best one in his team.
Yeah, he, best. Yeah, I mean, he's very specific. We'll look at that when I pull up the text.
First him as a peacemaker, like the crew gets the crew together.
Yes, very important.
But when the other captain was going around, I think he pointed as cannons or something. I wasn't sure. I was really confused at that point.
Yeah, I'm anticipating some confusion. He looks like he could withstand battle. Well, in the way that he's described, now, does he look like someone who can withstand battle? He's described, as beautiful. Right? He's beautiful, and of course it ties in with this idea of the, quote, handsome sailor.
He did, for example, punch the...
Yes, very important, good observation, right? So when in relating what he was like on the ship, everyone loves him. He has a natural, remember, it's very natural. Billy isn't looking to have people like him. People naturally gravitate towards him. Again, suggesting this almost otherworldliness quality. Right? These are hardened sailors. And the life of a sailor, at that time was a hard life. And he comes in, again, think of the description of the handsome sailor that we get in the first chapter. and not just in terms of the appearance, right? We see the word handsome, okay, handsome, but the other things that our narrator is telling us about what are the qualities of, again, in quotes, of the handsome sailor. It's like a stock character. Even before we meet Billy. What's the handsome sailor that's being described in that first chapter? Anyone? We have read the text, haven't we?
Sir, can you please repeat your question?
What in the first chapter, there's a description of this type of stock character called the handsome sailor.
Oh, do you mean the one with the scarf and the bonnet and African, I think?
Yes.
Okay.
Remember, that's how the story starts. The importance of beginnings. Why is he introducing this?
Wait, he's a stock character?
He's a type of stock character. In other words, it's not just a very, he's a sailor and he's handsome. It's a type of sailor that's referred to as the handsome sailor, right? And yes, our initial response to that is, okay, he's good looking, okay? But there's more to what the handsome sailor possesses in terms of his character, his quality, right? And what does it tell us about this type of handsome sailor? Because obviously, if we're being introduced to this concept of a handsome sailor, but we're not, initially, it's not Billy Budd. It's referring to this character, a very exotic character, and how people respond to this character. And then we segue into a discussion of Billy. And of course, we're meant to make the association that Billy is one of these handsome sailors. And it's not just about his looks. What are the other qualities of the handsome sailor? There's a lot of details in Melville's writing. And you need to be attentive to them. I mean, I'm obviously going to bring up the text, but I'm trying to elicit from you some responses before we look at it ourselves. So you should all have the text in front of you. You should be able just to find that. Well, we are a bit sleepy this morning. Okay, I'm going to pull up the text in a minute, but I will remind you that there's still issues with the conversion of the recordings of these classes. If it works, it worked. Worked for my class last Friday, didn't work yesterday. It's like 50-50. If it works, I will post the video. If it doesn't work, the video is lost. So I strongly urge you to be taking notes and being attentive to what goes on in this class, especially with a text like this. My concern is you're not reading in detail. These questions should be answered fairly easily. Everyone sees this? I put the screen share up.
Yes.
Okay. It's right here at the beginning. Okay, we can come back as here. This is, again, our setting. Note how we start. In the time before steamships. What are steamships? What is this suggesting? When was a time before steamships?
I mean,
Like,
sir,
wait.
later in the next chapters, we get exact dates. So
We will be getting exact dates, but this is a generalized, if it's a time before steamships, be like saying it was a time before cell phones. It's a similar thing. It's harking back to a time before there was the introduction, and we see this in detail, as just pointed out, with the dates, and this is when the ironclad ships, it was transforming. It was a time before the transformation due in large part to the Industrial Revolution, when things were simpler. There were no steamships, they were all sail ships. Okay, it's a time when you didn't have the kind of weaponry and the kind of productions of war that really transformed how war was played out. And it's important to remember that, because what this is going to, it comes back with the handsome sailor, and what Billy Budd may represent is a time when there was, and we see this when he talks about Admiral Nelson, when duty, honor, that kind of leadership, that where battles were face to face, hand to hand, as opposed to firing cannon. Certainly had cannon back in before the steamships, but not to the same level of weapon. Yeah, well, we know the specific dates, right? We're gonna see them, right? But of course, they're introduced at a specific time for a reason. One of the things you have to be, and one of the more challenging aspects of Melville's writing, particularly with Billy Budd, is we're hearing the voice of a narrator. Okay, yes, Herman Melville wrote this, but who's telling us this story? Let me see things like this. To return to what he was talking about. We're going to see a lot of these narrative intrusions. The narrator is an important character in this novella. Okay, it's a bit of an intrusive character because it is doing some judgments and evaluations for us. And we have to be wary of that because it's coming from, at times, seemingly a biased position. All right, this handsome sailor. Right, he's recounting, our narrator is recounting a time when he saw, right, this single object. It was the handsome sailor. And the reason you want to be attentive to that it's a stock character is because of the quotes. Right? with no perceptible trace of the vainglorious about him. What does that mean?
Is it that he kind of like doesn't recognize how great he is perceived by everybody else?
Thank you. Yes, right? We break this word down. You're going to see a lot of these types of words, right? I mean, it was mentioned that, you know, it wasn't so much the vocabulary as the confusion. Well, a lot of the confusion does stem from the vocabulary, and you have to be attentive to it, right? Vain and glorious. No perceptible trace of being vain, and the vain ties into glorious, right? You think yourself glorious, you're being vain. Rather, with an offhand unaffectedness of natural regality. What's natural regality? What's regality?
Well, being regal is like kind of being dignified and like I guess like higher,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like a higher level, I guess. So he wasn't affected by how high of a pedestal everybody else was putting him on, I guess.
He had an
Like how royal he was.
unaffectedness of, rather with the offhand unaffectedness of natural regality. It's saying that the handsome sailor has a natural, right, innate, doesn't have to work at it, regality, regal, as in, you know, monarchies of regal, elevated, as you were pointing out. It's in terms of not just status, but what associated with regal behavior is just, proper. This is why people gravitate to the handsome sailor. There's something, and what's important here, because of course this is just preparing us for Billy Budd, is that it's natural. He has a natural leadership quality, if you will. And he seemed to accept the spontaneous homage of his shipmates. Right? What's homage? If you give homage to somebody, what is that?
Respect.
Sorry?
Respect.
Yeah, right. Yes, you're respecting. I mean, there's obviously various levels, but yeah, respect is a good word for it. And it's note that it's spontaneous, and that ties into the natural. It's not like the handsome sailor has to work to gain the trust, the homage of his shipmates. They spontaneously react to him, right? Spontaneous, knee-jerk reaction. They don't have to be swayed. Doesn't have to go up there and give big speeches for people to start gravitating towards him. It's a natural aura, if you will, that surrounds this handsome sailor. We find a specific handsome sailor here, but again, it's a classification. It's a classification that draws people. People are drawn to this idea of the handsome sailor. And of course, yes, that's a quality in Billy Budd. And there's not necessarily a clear explanation for it. That's why I use that word aura, and that ties in with the theme and the idea here of, who is Billy Budd? that he has these qualities of the handsome sailor? How does one develop those qualities? Are they developed? Are you born with it? When we get this more detailed description of who this first handsome sailor we're meeting here, a common sailor, he's not a captain, he's not an admiral, so intensely black that he must needs have been native African of the unadulterated blood of Ham. What we note with this, we don't have to get into it too much because we've got to get through a lot of material, but of course it's a biblical reference. Right at the beginning, there's going to be many biblical references in this, and we need to discuss it. Yeah. But at this stage, just the invocation of the Bible contributes to this otherworldly quality that the whole story is peppered with, and in particularly Billy Budd. Much above the average height. He's very tall, this one, with the handkerchief, as was pointed out, and big hoops. A big part of what this is trying to do is introduce, at the very beginning, a universal quality to this idea of the handsome sailor. Right, we're going to meet Billy Budd. Billy Budd is an Englishman, 21 years old, who is clearly going to be identified with this character of the handsome sailor. But our first introduction to the handsome sailor is someone who is clearly not British. And it has not just an exotic element to it, but it's a universal element. That this type of character, this handsome sailor who has this natural regality, is a quality that transcends borders. It tells us as readers, as an audience, that the message, the theme, or themes and messages are going to have certain universal aspects to them. Commentary on more than just specific Billy Budd on this ship, but addressing a certain quality of human behavior and human character that transcends all borders. And that ties in, of course, with the idea that we're at sea. These are ships. And ships can touch on all borders. They're not locked in by land. Okay? This is, again, this is how you want to be going through this text. And you should, when you're doing this, if you see this Ham, you can always look it up. We'll return to the biblical references in due time. But you'd want to take note of that. You'd want to take note of seeing something in parentheses. And of course, you always want to take note of everything that goes on at the beginning. It's laying a foundation, which we need to follow. Okay. Again, and you'll be noticing a lot of this. To return, that's the narrator saying, I'm going to get back to my story. And then someone pointed out earlier, yeah, it's at times hard to follow. Seems to be jumping around. And certainly at the beginning here, when the narrator pauses, if you will, from his discussion of Billy Budd and the events, the immediate events at hand, to give us basically a history lesson. But of course, it's meant to give us a context. Which we'll have to look at.
Sir?
Yes.
Why did you highlight the tribute of a pause and stare and the less frequent of an exclamation? Why is that important?
Again, let's see, put the context. Spontaneous tribute rendered by wayfarers to this black pagoda of Othello. The tribute of a pause and stare and less frequent an exclamation. It's to highlight how people react to him. So the tribute that they give to this handsome sailor, okay, is they pause and at times stare, and sometimes they'll say something. And it's showing that it's impacting not just his fellow sailors, but people he encounters. And of course, at this stage, we're going, well, maybe that's just because he's different looking, right? He's tall, black, from Africa, and so on. Yes, and of course, that's it's directly counter to, if you will, Billy Budd. Billy Budd isn't standing tall and doesn't stand out in the same way that this handsome sailor does. But Billy does stand out. And people do pause and stare. So it doesn't matter whether you are clearly other or exotic within this milieu. What makes Billy exotic, other than what's emphasized a lot, is his looks. But we know it has to be more than that. Why is he referred to as the peacemaker? Why does that captain on the Rights of Man say he's my best? Is he best because he can do the work on the ship better than anyone else? We're not getting that. It's more than just in terms of best. It's best in terms of his relationship with those around him. And that's what this story is emphasizing. The power of that certain type of charismatic behavior. Not even behavior, charismatic aura, where people pause and stare and less frequently, but still do sometimes speak. Okay, so I mean, again, when I'm highlighting here, part of what I highlight is I'm anticipating what I'm going to be talking about in class, but I can't read anything without highlighting anything that strikes me, that I draw. That's why I don't go over everything with you that I highlight. We would be here all day, just getting through the first couple of chapters. But it's meant to, when you're learning, and I appreciate the observation. Yeah, you want to take note of that. And if you have questions of things that I've highlighted, exactly what you should do is ask. Because again, I can't cover everything. What I try to do is give you examples so that it instills in you a methodology which you can follow on your own when you're reading. And again, I'm going to emphasize this to you, and this morning was so far really been an example. Come with questions. And when I read this the first time, I'm going, what's up with this handsome sailor thing? Okay. Ask me those at the beginning of class. Please. Otherwise, I just go through the text. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Another thing, just on that note, and again, the things that I'm highlighting because they resonate with me, and of course, I'm reading this for the 10th time, right? So I know things that you don't know unless you've read it before. Right? An important little bit here, again, a lot of this is foreshadowing. Keep that in mind as the story unfolds. The moral nature, and what's important here is, again, we're talking about nature, human nature, as well as physical nature, as we'll see there at sea. The moral nature was seldom out of keeping with the physical make. Suggesting here that because if you have these physical attributes, that will impact your morality. And that's introduced to us here almost like it's a matter of fact. But as we'll see, that's going to be challenged. But it's also introducing this idea of morality. Very important theme in this story. Morality, duty. Right? It comes back to what I was saying earlier, and one of the things you want to be attentive to throughout is this dichotomy between the individual and the society. which is represented in these first chapters by the rights of man, the name of the ship, and the indomitable. What does indomitable mean? That's the name of the ship that Billy goes to. What does indomitable mean? We discussed the importance of the name of the first ship, the rights of man. What does indomitable mean?
Impossible to defeat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an aggressive, warlike term. All right. And that, again, is something we want to take note of. If, yes, you want to name your ship the Indomitable, you can't defeat, you can't sink my ship, all this stuff. But again, we have to go to the next level and look at the symbolism of what the ship is representing. And that's this, to some degree, controlling society. And we know it's controlling because the sailors are drafted. It's imposed on them that they have to come on this ship. We see that by them grabbing Billy. But this was standard practice at the time. Again, the example I give you is like a draft, where if you're drafted, you have to go. You don't have a choice. Or you go to jail. Right? And that, of course, has a direct tie-in with the mutinies that are going to be discussed. And it's getting at one of the core elements of the story is this struggle that the individual has with the restrictions that are imposed upon him or her by society. Very relevant, has always been very relevant to us, but obviously even more so if we look at our present situation dealing with this pandemic. We are being told that we have to follow certain procedures. And there's a lot of rebellion to this. I'm sure if you pay attention to the news, you're seeing anti-maskers out there protesting. This is an infringement on our freedoms and so on. And they're very vocal about it. Well, that is, again, an example of the kind of conflict between what society imposes on us and individual freedom. And this story is reflecting on that. How do we navigate as individuals through a society where the so-called impositions, and it doesn't have to be an imposition, doesn't have to be perceived as an imposition, is a necessary rule or regulation in order to ensure that society can function. Without the rules and regulations, society would crumble. There would be anarchy. People would just do what they want to do. I mean, that's an extreme example, but that's why all societies, ourselves included, we live in a democracy, and the concept of freedom is always being discussed, and we're seeing that heightened now with the pandemic. But of course, freedom is always a relative term. We have to pay our bills. We have to pay our taxes. Right? So there's a lot of things that we have to do that could be counter to what we want to do. And that is a limitation to our freedom. And I'm telling you that to contextualize, to some degree, the story we're looking at so that you can see it in relation to things that the way you're living right now, especially now with this situation we're all in. The world is. It gets back to the universal quality of it as well, right? It's not just in Canada that we have to live with these restrictions. It's throughout the world. Okay. So we segue from this discussion of the handsome sailor to Billy Budd, and obviously we're meant to make that connection. Billy Budd is going to be one of these handsome sailors. Of course, we're struck at the beginning. It doesn't look anything like the handsome sailor that was just described, and that's why we're looking at it at a second level. It's not just the appearances, it's some natural quality. Here's Billy. What does welkin-eyed mean? You may be sitting there saying, well, is it really important? You know, it's welkin-eyed means? Yeah, it is. If you're just reading through this, thinking, oh, okay, Billy Budd and all this stuff, you're going to really struggle to get a full understanding of what this is about.
Watery eyes?
Watery eyes? Anyone else?
Heavenly or
You know,
like sky.
sky. Yes. Did you look it up?
I looked it up when I read it.
Is anyone looking it up now as I'm asking this question while we're here? I mean, sure, you're on your computers, you have your phones. Those of you who've had me before know that I don't tell you you can't have your phones on for this very reason, as long as you don't abuse that. Of course, it doesn't matter now because you're not in the classroom. Blue eyes, thank you. Oh, sorry, okay, I'm looking for. Yeah, I mean, my point here is, yes, it's blue-eyed associated with the sky, okay, and of course that is a kind of, be very attentive to eyes, right? Eyes as a symbol, as a clue to certain elements of character. It's very important. So if we see he's got these welkin eyes, eyes blue like the sky. You may say, well, so what at this point? But you want it to register and you'll see so what. Because then it's speaking to his character. The author is very intentionally giving us a clue here. Welkin-eyed, blue, like the sky suggesting what, right? Goes back to the aura that surrounds Billy. Billy Budd, or what's up with this? Baby Budd. As more familiarly under circumstances hereafter to be given, he at last came to be called. Baby Budd. Does that strike anyone? Like, what does that mean? Does it mean it looks like a baby? It's an unusual thing, especially on a military ship.
Innocence?
Sorry?
His innocence?
His innocence, thank you, yes. What do we associate with babies? Innocence. It's very revealing. And of course, we're going to see how the story builds on that. The importance of reading carefully at the beginning. You miss these things at the beginning, and I'm telling, yes.
How innocent can he really be, though?
Well, that's what we're going to find out.
When I was reading, I did not really think of him as innocent or like, not like a baby. So when I think of an innocent person, I kind of feel like they would be more gullible at the same time. the only thing that I noticed was his, like, when he was left speechless, that I could associate.
Yes, well, we're going to come to that because that's important as well. And yes, you're saying, well, you know, I don't see him as being innocent. Of course, we have to see how it unfolds. But you have to be arrested by this. Then why baby Bud? And what do we associate with babies? We ensure, you know, as innocent as can be, right? For those of you who follow or read your poetry, it's Blake, innocence and experience. Yeah, so yeah, it does. If he doesn't seem innocent at this point, you know, again, we have to see how his character evolves. But we do know certain things about his character that could lend themselves to the idea of innocence. Not the least of which is what the captain was saying about him, which we can look at, you know, more closely. But what else do we know? Age 21, a foretopman in the British fleet toward the close of the last decade of the 18th century. So when is the last decade of the 18th century? What year is that?
1890, 1790.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So now it's setting the time for us. And it's important because that relates directly to the historical context which the narrator gives us in terms of the mutinies. And the mutinies are very important in order to understand and be prepared for what's going to transpire over the next 75 pages. Okay. What else do we know about Billy? What are we told about Billy? Who's Lieutenant Ratcliffe?
He's the guy who wants to take Billy.
Guy who wants to take Billy. He's the lieutenant from the Indomitable who's come over to find at least one sailor that he is going to bring on to the Indomitable. All right. I mean, I'm asking some pretty obvious questions here. And again, this is one of the real restrictions of not being in the classroom. I can't see your faces. I don't know if you haven't read the text, or if you're not reading it attentively. I have no way of reading your faces to know where you're at. Very frustrating from my perspective. And again, those of you who've had me before, I'm sure appreciate that. But regardless, you want to know who's who. And him only he elected. We talked about this, but it's important. Billy is singled out. Again, adding to this somewhat of a mystery surrounding why only Billy. Billy made no demur. Billy doesn't resist. Doesn't say, "Ah, really? Come on, I like it here. I got a lot of friends here. I even, you know, I've got red whiskers on my side now after I punched him out." No, he just goes with it. There's no resistance here. We have to, you know, well, we think there'd be some. Of course, he has no choice. But at the same time, it's speaking to his character. He's basically, okay, bye guys. I'm going over here now.
I mean, it wouldn't make sense for him to show resistance because he would have gone to prison.
Right. If
controllingness of the ship, like you mentioned.
Right. But what's being emphasized to us in a statement like this is, you know, again, we have
Old place.
Well, it could be, oh, Billy kind of, made a frustrated look and said, say something, but I like it here. And then they would have the reaction would be, well, too bad, you're coming with me. It's the fact that Billy doesn't resist, or even in his mind is what it's telling us, right? Again, if the narrator could say, Billy went, but not, in his mind, he was, sad to leave the rights of man. That's, again, emphasizing, okay, comes back to baby Bud and that idea of innocence, and just something there, because the narration draws our attention to it, that's saying, okay, he seems like a pretty easygoing guy. We touched on this, and I just want to bring you back to it because it speaks again to this conflict between the military and the individual and so on. But again, this is a lieutenant in a captain's office who unceremoniously invited himself into the cabin and also to a flask from the spirit locker. Right? So this lieutenant knows that, in fact, because the Rights of Man is not a warship, that he, in fact, is higher up in the hierarchy, and that this captain has no say. It's not just that Billy has no say, but his captain has no say. We have introduced here as well the concept, very important one. It's going to be coming up a lot, and you want to be looking for it, of the duty, the sense of duty, the duty that you have to your country, to your state, to your government, to your military, in contrast with the duty you have to yourself, the individual. And here we have, again, what we're getting here, why this is important, you see I've highlighted a lot, is we're learning much more about Billy here from what the captain is saying. You are taking my best man from me, the jewel of them. Note the response of the lieutenant. Yes, I know. Suggesting what? It's certainly understandable how the captain of the Rights of Man would be able to know that Billy is the best. He's the jewel of them all on the ship. But note the immediate response of the lieutenant who just met Billy.
But how can he know like how perfect he was, even though he just met him?
Well, that's the question I'm asking. Exactly. Yeah, and you should be saying to yourself exactly that. How would he know?
Rumors?
Never met him before. No indication, no suggestion at all that we've heard about this Billy Budd and we're coming to get him. No. How does he know? It ties back into the first description of the handsome sailor. And then comes back to the way I've been trying to suggest a way to talk about it in terms of this aura, this natural regality. Again, the operative word is natural. It's not because you're doing certain things. It emanates from you, which of course adds this mysterious concept of who Billy is. I come on the ship, lieutenant comes on the ship, we're going to need to get some men, at least one. Oh, you. I know you're the one to get. So there is no logical necessarily explanation, at least logic as it's understood within the confines of our human ability to rationalize.
Does that have to do with his looks, since they keep mentioning like handsome sailor? Is that impression that it left on the lieutenant?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of, yes, the looks, that's where the handsome comes in, but it's that other quality. It's not just the looks. You know, you're taking the best man from me, the jewel of them. It's not just because he's handsome. What is that other quality that makes Billy Budd the jewel of all the other sailors on the Rights of Man?
Peacemaker.
Right. So we get this. Blessed are the peacemakers, especially the fighting peacemakers. So now Billy is being described as a peacemaker. And we have this, you know, don't forget, you know, everything's important, but Red Whiskers. Again, who's Red Whiskers?
The big guy who got punched by Billy.
Right, he's the bully. So everyone takes to Billy right away. But Red Whiskers is going to challenge him. Right, there's always one. And what this is a demonstration with all this seeming beauty of Billy Budd. He's 21, he's like a baby. But he has this other quality as well. Quick as lightning, Billy let fly his arm. I dare say he never meant to do quite as much as he did, but anyhow, he gave the burly fool a terrible drubbing. And how did Red Whiskers respond after the drubbing? It's right here. Red Whiskers now really loves Billy. So we have two things going on here. One is the natural quality in Billy that has pretty much all the sailors gravitating to him. But there's one who resists. And Billy is capable of, even with this, you know, he's described as very delicate at times, but he can take out the big bully too. And again, I don't know if any of you, how far you've read, this will be serving as a certain kind of foreshadowing of things to come. Again, they all love him. Some of them do his washing, darn his socks, or trousers rather. Anybody will do anything for Billy Budd. You know, it's so emphasized here that we should be like intrigued. Well, what is it about this Billy Budd? Because his description, you know, okay, but there's something there. And of course, getting this at the beginning, well, we want to find out what it is. And again, referred to as peacemaker. These also, down here, Apollo. Okay. These are all descriptions of Billy, and there's a whole bunch of them that maintain this almost mythical, godly Apollo quality that is being attributed to him. And that's going to be continued, and it's going to evolve. Of course, what we need to do as well, when we're seeing all this incredible praise, we have to keep in mind that he also has this ability, that he can fight. We talked about this. It's coming from Paine's book, The Rights of Man. We've talked about this. It's very important, and this is being established for us before we get into the discussion of the mutiny, this enforced enlistment. Again, we've talked about it. I'm not going to go over it again, but you got to understand that in the context. of the imposition, the taking away of those rights of man to some degree. Again, a note here, Billy's action was a terrible breach of naval decorum. But in that decorum, he had never been instructed. What is that telling us? Well, okay, let's just look at this. I know we're getting close to the break, and when we come back, I need to touch on a couple things before we talk about the essays. But I really hope you guys are going to keep up with the reading with this. Do not fall behind with this one. It's going to be tough to catch up. Okay. So what happens when Billy is leaving, going to the other ship?
He waves his hand. I
Right.
think.
You know, making a salutation as to the ship herself, and goodbye to you too, old rights of man. And how does the lieutenant respond?
Sit back down.
Yeah, he yells at him, right? Instantly assuming the rigor of his rank. Right? This is not, we don't do this on the Indomitable. Know your place, know your rank, but of course with difficulty repressing a smile. And that speaks again to the allure of Billy, that even a hardened lieutenant from the military who's going to bring forth his authority when he sees a breaking of naval decorum, but with that repressed smile, which again is emphasizing there's something about Billy, because he would normally, the lieutenants was going to scream at him, and you know, the discipline was extraordinarily strict on ships, especially at this time because it's right after the mutinies. And again, it's speaking to this power that Billy has. And then we get to be sure Billy's actions was a terrible breach of naval decorum. But in that decorum, he had never been instructed. He doesn't know anything about naval decorum, even though he's been on, albeit not a military ship, a merchant ship. But again, that is suggesting what about Billy? It's been brought up before, tying back to baby Billy. Note the connections. This is a further bringing together this idea of Billy as
I don't know.
baby. What were we saying about his name being baby?
Innocence?
Yes. Right? He's innocent of what the proper naval decorum is. He doesn't know what it is because he's never been instructed in it. And this now is continuing the idea of Billy as being somewhat of a blank slate. That ties in to when he reveals that he's a foundling. He doesn't have a past. Only God knows his past. He's a blank slate to a large degree. All we know about is his looks, this innocent behavior, but he doesn't seem to really understand perhaps the situation he's in. But of course, tying back up to here, and goodbye to you too, old rights of man. Well, yes. Billy is saying goodbye to the rights of man, to his rights that he might have been able to enjoy on that particular ship. Now he's going into a very different environment. Environment that is in conflict to a large extent with the idea and concept of rights of man. All right. As we'll shortly see, his entire family was practically invested in himself. He is, it's all him. Again, there's no connections. He is an entity into himself. And that, again, contributes to this mystery of who he is. Let's just touch on this for emphasis. Again, the need to really be familiar with this is so essential in order to be able to interpret, understand, and analyze what's going to happen later. Without this information, without this type of understanding of these foundational issues regarding Billy, you will really have potentially great difficulties unpacking what's going to happen in the later chapters. So we go here, please, sir, I don't know, right? Just again, so where you can find it, because there's a question, I don't know, on an exam, something like that. You want to know where to look. You don't know where you're born, and this, again, emphasizing God knows. So, yeah, I mean, that's one sense, who is your father? God knows, sir. Yeah, on the surface, I don't know. But it's introducing, again, I've told you to be attentive to biblical, theological themes. We've already seen that Billy has been associated with pagan god of Apollo. He's been associated with Hercules, Greek mythological god types. We've seen him earlier, I forget where it is now, in terms of his looks as a Greek statue. Who is your father? God knows, is introducing this other potential theme in terms of Billy's identity as being responsible only or answering only to God, because there's no one else. Do you know anything about your beginning? No, sir, but I have heard that I was found in a pretty silk-lined basket hanging one morning from the knocker of a good man's door in Bristol. The classic foundling. Billy Budd was a foundling. By blow, and evidently noble one. Noble descent was as evident in him as in a blood horse. That ties back again. Immediate recognition through some kind of natural aura that suggests this idea of nobility. Comes back again to the handsome sailor.
What is the significance of the blood horse?
Oh, it's a reference to the nobility. It's a particular kind of horse that was sought after very much by nobility. Okay, so a blood horse, my understanding is a very regal horse, if you will. So the noble descent, or actually, and I think in a more simple is if the horse is coming from a bloodline of great horses, right? Nobility tends to come through where you're coming from, through blood and genealogy and so on. Okay, so it's just, again, type of simile to give us an idea of how noble descent, I mean noble descending from a line of nobility, and a blood horse is descending from a line of noble horses. If you think about it in terms of, if anyone follows horse racing, right? Often horses that do well in racing are taken out of the racing circuit in order to breed, to get that blood into the next generation of horses who will then take over as winning the Kentucky Derby and so on. Does that help?
Yes, sir.
Again, finding out who he is, one to whom not yet had been proffered the questionable apple of knowledge. What is that? We've seen apples before in this class.
Yeah, it's about the Adam and Eve.
Yes. Okay. And then after our discussion of this in Kafka's work, this should have jumped right out at you. Questionable apple of knowledge. What else do we know? He was illiterate. He could not read, but he could sing. And like the illiterate nightingale, was sometimes the composer of his own song. It's illiterate. He hasn't been proffered the questionable apple of knowledge, which means if he hasn't been offered the apple of knowledge, does that mean he doesn't have knowledge? And then, of course, we're asking, what kind of knowledge is that? And the knowledge, you know, if we go back to the Adam and Eve story, it was the knowledge, the awareness of their nakedness, which was not an awareness of their actual situation as human beings, where now there's shame and guilt and sin. He hasn't, it's suggesting he hasn't taken a bite of that apple yet. Well, what was the state of, and of course he's described specifically as Adam down here, right? So the connection with the apple to Adam. And what was Adam and Eve's, what was the state of their existence before they ate the apple? Come on, we talked about this when we were talking about Kafka. The eating of the apple was the fall of Adam and Eve from their pure state of innocence to their awareness of things that are particularly human, you know, human after the eating of the apple, such as guilt and shame and things like that. And of course, mortality. So again, the buildup as we were reading up to this point of this suggestion, what is baby? You know, we know we need to get to know Billy Budd because the story is entitled Billy Budd. And we were saying innocent, and I think we were talking about, I don't really see him as innocent, and you know, it could be, and this. Well, now we're getting more through these references, biblical references, poetic references with the nightingale. He could not read, but he could sing. Like the illiterate nightingale, he's being compared to a nightingale, which has a long history in literature, poetry in particular, of representing that quality that the poet has, almost like a divine quality, to be able to create poetry through the invocation of the muses. It heightens this otherworldly sense of who Billy Budd is. Okay, very quickly before we go on break. What does the narrator suggest is perhaps his only flaw?
Like a speech impediment?
Yes. And what does, important to remember this, well, let's look again, we've got 5 minutes till the break. And it's really, again, as everything I've been trying to point out, really important. No visible blemish indeed, as with the lady, no, but an occasional liability to a vocal defect, a stutter. Though in an hour of elemental uproar or peril, he was everything that a sailor should be, yet under sudden provocation of strong-hearted feeling, emotions, when he gets emotional, his voice, otherwise singularly musical, tying it back into the singing of the nightingale, as if expressive of the harmony within, was apt to develop an organic hesitancy. In fact, more or less of a stutter, or even worse. What's worse than stuttering? Suggesting can't even speak, loses his voice. In this particular Billy was a striking instance. That the arch interferer, the envious marplot of Eden, still has more or less to do with every human consignment to this planet of Earth. In every case, one way or another, he is sure to slip in his little card, as much as to remind us, I too have a hand here. What is this? Who's the arch interferer? When you read this, did you ask yourself, what is he talking about here? Pick up on the fact that, okay, Billy has a speech impediment. He stutters, or sometimes doesn't look like he can talk at all. That stutter is being attributed to somebody, as if somebody put that stutter into Billy. Who? Yes, thank you, Benjamin. The devil. How do we know it's the devil? Arch interferer in the envious marplot of Eden. Who interfered in Eden? Who tempted? Yes, it was the serpent, but the serpent was in the guise of the devil, of Satan. And what this is telling us is, now this comes back to what I was saying, talking about in terms of the narrator. The narrator is telling us that it looks like the way he's interpreting Billy's stutter is that it is a reminder incepted into all human beings by Satan that in every case, one way or another, he is sure to slip in his little card, as much as to remind us, I too have a hand here. It's telling us that the stutter that Billy has, otherwise his perfect specimen, whatever he is, but that the devil is involved in all our lives. The devil is always going to be lurking around to slip in his little card, in this case, to slip in the card of the stutter, just to remind everyone, God is not alone in all this. I'm here as well. That's really poignant, powerful. What it does, two things. One is it introduces Satan, and you're going to see more of his handiwork, but of course it also ties in with all the biblical references right back to when he said, who are you? God knows. So now we're really establishing this potentially theological dimension, this mystery, this mythology of who is this Billy Budd. There's something about him, handsome sailor, all this stuff, that is, again, otherworldly. And of course, when we see talking about Satan and God, that's otherworldly as well. Okay, It's 10 o'clock. By all means, we're not going to spend too much. We'll spend a bit of time. I do want to talk again about the exam. I want to touch when we come back on the mutiny and chapters 6 and 7. What happens in those? Who are we introduced to in chapters 6 and 7?
I don't think we were required to read chapter 7.
Okay, but he's introduced to I did say
Sure.
initially 6, but then I suggested read through 7 because they kind of go hand in hand. Who are we introduced to in chapter 6?
Edward, Captain Edward.
Yeah, Captain Veer, Starry Veer. And that's going to be, and we have to look at that in the context of the mutinies and the description and praise of Admiral Nelson. So we're going to touch on that after the break, and then I will go over that document for your essay writing and so on. Come back with questions if you have them, or concerns. Any questions now before we break? Then we will see you at 10:30.
Just one question.
Yes.
It's about the thing. Could it be concerning like freedom and rights, since the ship was the man of rights, and then he moves out of it to a military ship, and we mentioned that he loses his right? Could it be dabbling in the themes like how his freedom and his attitude are going hand to hand, and how is it restricting him?
Yes. I mean, certainly that's what you want to be, cognizant of now, because as we read it, as we just did, you can see all that, right? And the importance of he's going from the rights of man to a military ship, that contrast between individuality and society and the impositions and limitations that society imposes on the rights of man. But that's also obviously coupled with this other element of the otherworldliness. And of course, it's introducing the theological theme as well. So how does that religious component tie in with the very seemingly secular individual rights and societal impositions? But now introduced as well is elements of religion, theology, and how that's going to tie in and mesh with this conflict.
And I'm not familiar with the history, just asking, is there a war or a conquering, but like what's happening for these ships to be going in and out?
They're at war with France.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that a bit when we talk about the mutinies.
Okay.
Okay, that's when we get back from break. That's
That's
great. That's a great question. No, that's exactly the type of questions I'm hoping you're all asking, because it is confusing. And again, I'm not going to go into the history of the conflict with France and so on, but you need to know that there is that, and how that relates to everything that transpires. Okay. 10:30 then. We'll see you in a bit. There, we're back. Okay. So again, let's go back into the text. What is, we had the question initially, like you wanted to look at this chapter 3 and its difficulty, or there are problems with it. Be more specific. Is there a particular passage that you're concerned about, or was it the general concept of what the mutiny constitutes and why and how it relates to the story at hand? It relates, in the most simplistic terms, this is all taking place on a warship, and a warship that's at war shortly after this great disruption to the whole apparatus, the whole military naval apparatus. Right, we get here, right? The final suppression of the mutiny, but only made possible perhaps by the unswerving loyalty of the Marine Corps and voluntary resumption of loyalty again among influential sections of the crew. So what's being emphasized here is this idea of loyalty, which of course ties into a sense of duty. So while it was disruptive to say the least, it was finally brought together. The Marine Corps, that's not the Navy, right? So they had to be put down. So there was arrests, killings, and so on. And then the voluntary resumption of loyalty, they were disloyal, then they came back to do their duty, and very much because they were at war. Of the thousands of mutineers, the word patriotism, they were prompted thereto by patriotism or pugnacious instinct. It's an interesting, how do they tie into each other, or by both. Sorry, something popped up. Okay, let me get rid of that. So again, always keeping in mind the main themes that we've been talking about. Prompted by patriotism or instinct, or both. And this helped to win a coronet for Nelson and the Naval Crown of Crowns for at the Battle of Trafalgar. So all the details about the mutiny relate to this tension, extreme tension that would be prevalent on these warships, being resolved to some extent by patriotism, duty, and instinct. That ties in again with the natural charismatic qualities of the handsome sailor. It's instinctual, it's innate, and most importantly, or both. And then that segues into Nelson, famous British admiral. To the mutineers, those battles, Trafalgar, the one on the Nile, and especially Trafalgar, were a plenary absolution and a grand one for all that goes to make up scenic naval display, heroic magnificence in arms. Those battles, again, emphasizing Trafalgar, stand unmatched in human annals. And these battles that are unmatched in human annals, magnificence, naval display, tie into Nelson. It is suggesting that Nelson not only was a great militarist, but also had an element of magnificence that helped very much to bring back the mutineers to give up their rebellious behavior in order to follow Nelson into battle. The power of a leader. So in terms of how do you quell the possible rebellious nature of the sailors on your ship is involved with a leader who commands respect. In this case, Nelson's main respect seems to be in his military prowess, but suggesting as well, as we'll see as we go on, also relating to a cult of personality. And of course, the other way that you keep it under control is discipline. If you break the rules, there are consequences. We saw a touch of that when Billy was transporting over to the new ship, when he's waving back at everybody, and the lieutenant says, you know, you don't do that. That's not proper naval decorum, and there could be consequences. But at that stage, you know, Billy's just coming over, and you remember how the lieutenant even smiles, because Billy, he's not going to be an agitator. Doesn't think. Other questions involving chapter 3? I mean, there's more here. Again, we can't go through everything in detail, but a lot of when it's referencing this type of magnificence and this kind of loyalty and duty, it is, as we saw at the very beginning of the story, harping back to a time before these steel-clad ships. And back when there seemed to have been more of an emphasis on that kind of loyalty. All right. Get in here when we get into the next chapter. You know, when the introduction of gunpowder and how that changes the whole nature of how warfare is conducted, and when it becomes seemingly less honorable. Because rather than facing your opponent face to face and so on, you're now shooting from distance. Harping back to an earlier time, which the narrator, because remember the narrator works as a character here, seems to be nostalgic for. So chapter 4 starts with this invocation of types to Tennyson. Who's Tennyson? Anyone wonder who that was? If you look at your books, right, again, one of the things about doing right, the book that I ordered, you'll see, and you'll see this in a number of chapters, and you want to be attentive to it. Above it doesn't show as well here in this copy that I'm putting up, but if you notice in your books, it's italicized, right, and it precedes the actual text. It's separate from the narrator's story. Again, I can't see that if you look at your books. And it's a quote concerning the greatest sailor since our world began, and that quote is attributed to Tennyson. Did anyone look up who Tennyson is? Anyone know who Tennyson is? take that as a no. Try to get into the habit of looking it up. Okay. Tennyson is Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a great Victorian poet, and he wrote poems about Nelson, referring to him as the greatest sailor since our world began. That's alerting us that in this chapter 4, this is what we're going to discuss. And it's acknowledging a basic, almost universal recognition of the greatness of Nelson. Note as well, and these are little, not little, actually quite big, structural elements of the story that you want to be noting. Here's our narrator, the character who's telling the story. It's not Melville. It's a character who's relating the story to us. If the reader will keep me company, I shall be glad. So that's screaming at us that he's a character. So what's all this business about Nelson? And again, harping back to how gunpowder has changed things. The monitors. Monitor is a famous, one of the first ironclad ships. Again, European ironclads. There certainly seems to be, and since the narrator is drawing attention to himself here, it helps us to remind ourselves that this is the narrator's assessment of things, backing it up with citing Tennyson and so on. Honest sense of duty, right, is the first. First what? Personal prudence, even when dictated by quite other than selfish considerations, surely is no special virtue in a military man. While an excessive love of glory and passioning a less burning impulse, the honest sense of duty is first of all. This idea of virtue, what's being referenced here? What are they talking about here? Who's Alfred? Alfred, in his funeral ode on the victor of Waterloo, famous Battle of Waterloo that brought down Napoleon, ventures not to call him the greatest soldier of all time. Again, I don't want to risk getting bogged down in these historical details. It's about Wellington, who fought at the Battle of Waterloo. Famous battle, famous general of the British Army, defeating Napoleon. Alfred, anyone? I just said his name a couple of minutes ago. Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I'm not going to be able to do this on the page, right? The greatest sailor since our world began. Yes, he just said Tennyson. He didn't give us the full name, anticipating that most would know who he was referring to. But as well, remember, the greatest sailor since our world began. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, in his funeral ode to the victor of Waterloo, which is Wellington, does not call him the greatest soldier of all time, though in the same ode, he invokes Nelson as the greatest sailor since our world began. You would have wanted to be able to notice that this is the same as this, and make those connections. And you can only do that with a very close intensive reading. Yes.
Earlier you said we should compare Captain Nelson with Captain Burr.
Yeah.
So Nelson is this all great, almighty, like by Tennyson. He's like, oh, this glorious person with honor, and he's really good at the sails.
Right, and it's not just Tennyson. Tennyson immortalized him in a sense through his poetry, but it was Nelson is a well-known historical figure who was revered in the annals of British history, certainly naval history. Go on.
But how about Captain? Oh my God, can I say his last name?
Captain Vere. Yeah, don't worry about pronunciation. Just say Vere for now. How does Nelson tie in with Captain Vere? I think is what you're asking.
Yes.
Okay, that's the question you should be asking. And of course, it's hard to know at this point because we're limited by having not finished the book. But we want to be alerted to, yes, we're segueing, as I mentioned earlier, directly from Nelson, who is, epitomizes the great naval captain admiral, the leader, not just in terms of military prowess, but in terms of his cult of personality. Right? It's even mentioned at one point here that he was sent to a particular ship that there seemed to be unrest on, and just the power of his presence and the respect that he commanded was enough to quell any possible insurrection. So again, the segue here, this brief chapter 5 from Nelson, still talking about Nelson, but well, again, this is to address your question, Karen, because that's what we're leading to now, right? Is the introduction of Captain Vere. I'm going to tell her in a minute. I'm just trying to find it here. So discontent foreran the two mutinies, and more or less it lurkingly survived them. Right. So the discontent of the two mutinies, okay, lurkingly survived them. That means what? That discontent is still there. It's lurking. Hence, it was not unreasonable to apprehend some return of trouble, sporadic or general. Just pull this up because this will lead us right into, I think. Wow. Okay. One instance of such apprehensions in the same year with this story, Nelson, then Vice Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson, being with the fleet off the Spanish coast, was directed by the admiral in command to shift his pennant from the captain, that's the name of the ship, to the Theseus. And for this reason, that the latter ship, Theseus, having newly arrived on the station from home where it had taken part in the great mutiny, danger was apprehended from the temper of the men. And this is now how it brings the more general description of Nelson and his accomplishments to something that now becomes much more specific, and specific in relation to our story. That Nelson was sent to this ship that looked like it was in close proximity to having a rebellion. And it was thought that an officer like Nelson was the one, not indeed to terrorize the crew into base subjection, but to win them by force of his mere presence back to an allegiance, if not as enthusiastic as his own, yet as true. What's that telling us? Does everyone understand what this is doing? And why it comes here at the end of chapter 5, after we've learned all this other stuff about Nelson. That Nelson it is suggested that Nelson has a certain quality, okay, to motivate the potential rebellious sailors to abandon their rebellion and to reform an allegiance with what the military comes to represent in terms of the society and the impositions of society imposes on the individual, and to this sense of duty and responsibility. Not by terrorizing them. That was often the approach that the military would take. Okay, if I see anything that remotely smells of insubordination, you're going to be flogged. You're going to be thrown in jail. Strict, at times overwhelming discipline. And that doesn't always work, and that can inflame the situation. So the suggestion here is the way that Nelson did it was not through this terrorizing of the sailors, but to win them by force, and this is the key here, of his mere presence. What does that remind us of in terms of the power of just a presence?
Presence of Billy Budd.
Yes. The peacemaker who was a peacemaker just by being there. This aura that I've referred to. So this ties in with that. Building to introduce Captain the Honorable Edward Fairfax Vere. Vere, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. So, obviously, we're alerted that we should be comparing him with Nelson. Nelson, who has been attached through what we just looked at to Billy Budd in terms of the power of these individuals to impact in a positive way those around them. What do we know about Captain Vere? Is he like Nelson? Somewhat, not at all. What are we told in the text?
He's strict.
Strict, yeah. In what way? Where do we see that?
Regarding discipline.
Yeah, strict or professional. Does he? What do we learn about? Like, what is the? There's all that discussion about how he reads books and stuff, right? And is suggesting through that he's very much by the book. But what do we know about his personality? Is he flamboyant? I mean, Nelson was known to be a little, very much aware of his power over others
and to flaunt it to some extent. Does Veer strike us like that? What's his nickname? Anyone? What's his nickname? What's he called?
Starry Ver?
Starry,
Sorry.
right? There you go. What does that suggest? Again, taking it into the context of the other things we learn about him.
Strict.
Sorry?
Strict.
Strict? How so?
Just as mentioned before, his professional acts and how he's like wanting everything to be like carried out perfectly within the guidelines, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, again, very much by the book.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at some of the words that are used to describe him. His unobtrusiveness of demeanor. What does that mean? Anyone? Unobtrusive. What is unobtrusive? Obviously, the opposite of
Not
obtrusive.
in your face.
Yes. Unobtrusive means you're not in your face. Of his demeanor, what's a demeanor?
His act.
His way of acting. So what this is telling us is the way he acts is not obtrusive, right? So the way it's being phrased means that he's not in your face. Okay, it may have proceeded from a certain unaffected modesty of manhood, sometimes accompanying a resolute nature, and that nature talks a lot about it here when we're looking at the characters. A modesty, again, in this, at all times not calling for pronounced action, and which shown in any rank of life suggests a virtue aristocratic in kind. Remember the assignment exercise I gave you, right? Analyzing a passage, okay? Which you know we're going to be continuing throughout the semester now, which you should anticipate will be part of your midterm. So when for instance, I could put this passage here and ask you to analyze it in 200 to 300 words in an exam. How would you go about doing that? Contextualized, right? Within the context of what we're reading. What does this tell us? Right? This is exactly how I could word it in your exam. What does this passage tell us about Captain Veer? I could be nasty too and not even mention Captain Veer. So you'd have to be able to identify the passage and know what it's referring to or who it's referring to. But for now, what is this telling us? We've already unpacked the first part. He's not obtrusive in his behavior. What else does this passage tell us?
He's a good-natured person. He's modest. He's very nice in his act, and we get is that he's professional later on. So what we can understand that he's like someone you can approach, basically. It's not like a superior officer where it's just like forcing down everything on you and belittling you, I would say.
Yeah, that's not bad. Yes, I mean, a lot of that is we can sense from here, and what you added to that is what you're gleaning from the readings that surround it, which is exactly what you're supposed to do when you analyze a passage like this. But of course, the things that you'd want to mention as well is, suggest virtue aristocratic in kind. It's an interesting one, a little tougher to unpack what is suggested by being aristocratic. Okay, but at times not calling a pronounced action and which shown in any rank of life suggests a virtue. All right, so that's the narrator praising the type of aristocratic demeanor that seems to be part of Captain Vere. So it tells us quite a bit that he seems to be, fairly quiet guy, very modest, a resolute nature, all right, related to that modesty. And at all times not calling for pronounced action. It's like, the type. Everyone calm down, all right? Don't count to 10 before we act. And coming from aristocratic background, which lends itself to that hierarchy, right? Societal hierarchy. So he's not just have the military hierarchy of a captain, but he also comes from a societal upper echelon of society, that hierarchy as an aristocrat. Okay. When you see as much time spent describing someone, a character, especially if it follows a lengthy description of an historical character, right? It's drawing attention to the importance of this character and the importance for us to have a clear idea of who he is, because we're going to have to assess our assessment of who he is in relation to the actions he'll be taking in the future.
I'm sorry to just
Sure.
go check. How about Nelson? I'm just a little bit confused now. So he's well-mannered, he's good, he's professional, he has like this good aura about him. But Nelson, we keep saying like he's a victor, he's done all this good things.
Well, again, the first thing to remember is to be able to distinguish between the character of Captain Vere and the historical reality of Nelson. So Nelson isn't a character in this story, right? He is a historical figure of great prominence, right? It's told to us in the text, but it would also, for an audience, and that's the reference to Tennyson's poem about him and so on, the audience would recognize him as an historical character, not a character in this play, in this story. Okay? So as such, we have to draw that distinction, recognize that distinction, and then recognize as well that we're meant to see in our first introduction of this particular captain, who is a character in our story, in relation to the elevated, incredibly elevated status of Nelson, both as captains, and then as we saw at the latter part of our looking at Nelson, a captain who has to deal with unrest, potential mutiny on a ship. So what that's telling us when we get back to our story is chances are we're going to have some unrest on this ship. And Nelson's not going to be there because, of course, Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is going to be the captain who's probably going to have to deal with something that's going to unfold on this ship that has some kind of relation with the mutinies and unrest, etc. So it's used to extrapolate, if you will, from the descriptions and discussion of Nelson to help us. Then we can't help but bring Nelson who's now incepted into our minds, into our understanding of Captain Vere, and that what was incepted in our minds in the previous chapter will now come out in some manner as we are reading about this particular captain. And we look to see what kind of connections we can make. Captain Vere is not a hero in the sense that Nelson is, as being this world-renowned military leader. So we're taking something that's very grandiose in Nelson and now putting it into the much more average, a captain on a single ship. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, kind of. I feel like I should read ahead a bit more, then I'll understand better.
Yeah, well, no, and that is very particular to, you know, I mean, ideally, you know, I would have said, okay, finish Billy Budd for today. And those of you who are thinking of going on to university, that's what you get. But there is an advantage, I would argue, to reading it this way, because we're able to really, you know, spending as much time as we are looking at these first 7 chapters in such detail, that puts you in a position that when you continue reading, you're going to be able to recognize things that you might not have recognized if you'd read it straight through before we start this kind of reading of the text. I mean, ideally, at the university, you read it once, you study it, then you read it a second time. Doing it this way, it's almost as if you're reading a serialized version of the story. It's once a week, you know, another 7 chapters will be published in such and such a magazine. That's often how literature was distributed. In Melville's time, this wasn't, not this story, but you're familiar with Charles Dickens, most of his novels were serialized. And everyone had to wait till next week or next month to read the next chapters. So they had all that time to mull over, to do what we're doing here, trying to get a best understanding that we can, and then bring that understanding to the next chapters that would be published the following week.
Sir, can I comment on something
Sure.
after this reading? We have been constantly being introduced all these figures of authority in each chapter of it, and I don't know. It's just like, oh, now we have this captain. Now we have this lieutenant. Now we have this critical figure. Now we have this another captain. Like, there's just boom, 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 boom. All these figures of authority just going around. And
Well,
I kind of grasp like Billy's situation very well. Like, since he's the main character out of it all, assuming the title of the book.
Yes, and so we have to anticipate where's this going, because we know it's what we should anticipate. It's all going to come back to Billy. And what we have to sift through here is, of course, who are the going to be the main characters, the main parties involved. We know we can dismiss Nelson because we know. Hold on, sorry, just hold on 1 minute. Sorry.
I'm going to the store. I might be seeing Kevin later. If I'm not coming home in between, I'll call you. Okay, love you, bye.
Bye. Sorry. It's one of the things of working at home. One of my sons is leaving. So anyways, no, I mean, one of the things you have to be able to do, like, we know we can dismiss Nelson as a character because we know he's not a character in the story. So then we look at the others. We met, you know, we've met a lot of people, but which characters have been emphasized? We know Bill.
Of the Freeman rights of, oh my gosh,
The rights of man. Yes, we're introduced to him along with the lieutenant, right? But we haven't seen them since then. And what we do know is that Billy's no longer on the rights of man. So that kind of takes that captain out of the picture a little bit. He may come back. We don't know. The lieutenant, same thing. He was just involved in there, and then he'll be back. Trust me. But what we have up to this point is really Billy, and then we have 2 chapters introducing the captain. So while there's a lot of encounters here as we go through this, part of the process of what we're doing in this kind of reading is to say, okay, who are going to be the most important? And for the reasons that I was saying, especially the way Nelson is discussed right before we meet Captain Vere, should be alerting us to the fact that Captain Vere is probably going to be important here. And then that's confirmed when we read through chapters 6 and 7, because we get a lot of information about it, which, as I said, blends with the information about Nelson, because we know they're meant to be connected. They're both captains. If nothing else, that alerts us. It's the same way before we meet Billy, we're introduced to the first handsome sailor. You know, minor character, is not nearly as much written about him as there is about Nelson, but nonetheless, that segues into Billy, and we're meant to make, they're both what? They're both handsome sailors. In this case, they're both captains. So the description of the first one is meant to help us sift through the descriptions of the main ones. Does that help? Or it just makes it more confusing? Keep it in mind. And again, you have to be anticipating. It can be frustrating at this point, but you're building the foundation. And I promise you, with this kind of a reading, when you get further along and things do get a little, you know, complicated in terms of the action itself, you'll be able to glean what's going on because you're going to know who's who is being emphasized. Be patient. Okay. Okay, because I want to just finish up with Captain or Starry Veer before we talk a little bit about the exam. So we come back to this idea of Starry. And actually, before we get there, what leads up to it helps us, and it's important because it gives us a much clearer concept of who this is. So Captain Veer, though practical enough, so we get that practicality, upon occasion would at times betray a certain dreaminess of mood. Standing alone on the weather side of the quarterdeck, one hand holding by the rigging, he would absently gaze off at the blank sea. All right, little dreaminess. At the presentation to him then of some minor matter interrupting the current of his thoughts, he would show more or less irascibility, but instantly he would control it. So what this is telling us about Captain Veer is he has a tendency to daydream, gazing off at the blank sea. And if someone interrupts that, he would get a little irritated. You're breaking my gaze. Whatever I'm thinking about. But he would control it. And the key here is that he can control it. This is partly where the starry comes from, right? If you're starry, you're kind of like gazing up at the stars. You know, that lends itself to the dreaminess of mood. Of course, there's a much more, which we don't have time to explore, that the Starry Veer that comes from another poet, Andrew Marvell's poems, which is referring to a character out of that poem. And if we had the time, we could explore how the character in Andrew Marvell's poem relates to our captain here. But that would involve a close study of a very long poem, and the poem that it's referring to is quite long. Okay? By all means, you can go look at it yourself. So we have this idea of he's starry-eyed, he's a little dreamy, unobtrusive demeanor. We see his nickname Starry, and then we have this emphasis on books, and this is going to be important. Books to which every serious mind of superior order, occupying any active post of authority in the world, naturally inclines. Books treating of actual men and events, no matter of what era, history, biography, and unconventional writers. Philosophize upon realities. This is telling us what? That he's a thinker. Very much so. He reads all kinds of books about history, and he is reading books to which every serious mind of superior order and authority would naturally incline to. This is what I meant earlier when I say he goes by the book. All right, but it's also suggesting that, you know, with such a wide range of knowledge, that maybe he would be thinking outside the box as well. It's suggesting that, okay, you're savvy to, especially when it says unconventional writers, so you're savvy to unconventional possible actions and so on. But, and this is, again, making these connections, when you come back up here, what we already looked at, but now we look at it after that latest information. If he is off gazing, thinking, probably about the books he's reading, if anyone interrupts it, he initially gets upset, but instantly gains control. It's suggesting a bit of a complex nature in Captain Vere. That a lot of awareness of alternative approaches to things and alternative philosophies and ways of thinking, but bottom line is he is in control of himself insofar as there is a role that he has to play, and he has to play it by the book. That will, I think, become much clearer as you continue to read. It's again, it talks here. Well, we told he's an exceptional character. I know some of you may not have read chapter 7, because I think I said afterwards you should reach out, because again, it goes hand in hand with chapter 6. He had a marked learning, and again, confirming what we've already discussed. Everything intellectual. He loved his books. An exceptional character he's referred to here. Again, this is the narrator. Oh, that's right. That's because we jumped over from there. His settled convictions were as a dike against those invading waters of novel opinion, social, political, and otherwise. Now, this is, again, Captain Vere is a complex character. But this is extremely telling. What is this telling us? And we're going to wrap this up soon. His settled convictions. What's that?
Decisions.
Yeah, his convictions, his beliefs, his settled convictions. They're already settled. These are not going to change. Whereas a dike against those invading waters, right? A dike that's put up in to stop the flow of waters, right? Against those invading waters of what? Of novel opinion. What's novel opinion?
New opinions.
Yeah, new ideas. New ideas, social, political, and otherwise. So despite the fact, and this is where we see a complex nature in Captain Vere, despite the fact that he's reading about novel ideas, right, unconventional ideas, he has settled convictions which will prevent those ideas from influencing his decision-making, despite the fact that he knows about those ideas. Because he's bookish, he's read about them, but he has a settled, ingrained attitude and approach towards things. He's willing to entertain alternative ideas. He's willing to learn about those alternative ideas, but ultimately he holds to what is presumably, since it's against novel, new opinion, he is old school, entrenched in certain old school attitudes regarding his position, both, well, certainly, first and foremost, as a naval commander, but also we have to be thinking, how is it when he is not in this position? Because remember, they talk about him, you know, if you saw him on the street, you wouldn't even recognize him in any way as being a naval commander. So he has this duality within him that is a reflection of the broader duality that we've been talking about between the individual and the collective, the society. He has a role to play as a captain of a naval military ship, and he has settled convictions about how that's to be done. But as an individual, he is reading all these unconventional things. And those unconventional attitudes might be applicable outside of the structure and restrictions of the societal life as represented by the ship, the Indomitable. But on the Indomitable, he has to put up a barrier to prevent those invading waters from swaying him from these convictions. So we have the two types of convictions, if you will. And this is again represented in the character of Captain Vere, this duality, right? That speaks as well when he's gazing out at the sea. You know, that's him, his individual self, when he's thinking about the books he's reading and so on. If that's disrupted, you say, whoa, you know, don't, oh, wait a minute, I got to remember my role. And he gains control. He's controlling these individualistic impulses or ideas that in all likelihood he is gathering from all the reading that he does. Okay? So a dry and he's perceived as a dry and bookish gentleman. And all the rest of here, what we're seeing is suggesting that he's not your typical captain, but he is by the book and he is respected for these settled convictions that he has. But he's not flamboyant in any way, and he doesn't draw attention to himself. Okay? It says he would be as apt to cite some historic character and incident of antiquity as that he would cite from the moderns, again, showing that he is entertaining or at least aware of these alternatives when it, you know, when it says at one point here, I don't remember exactly where, you know, most of his colleagues, you know, they read the newspaper, that's it. Okay? So bottom line is, what you want to take from this is, well, there's a lot, I get it, but that this is the setup. And where we're left with is Billy's coming onto the ship. We have, you know, a lot of information about Billy. There's quite a bit of mystery to him. There's this aura. There's these references to mythology and theology and all these things as they pertain specifically to this seemingly almost unsettling quality that he has to influence and impact people. And we have Captain Vere, who is much more seemingly pragmatic and practical and so on. And they're obviously going to have an adventure of sorts together because it's all been set up as Billy comes on to the new ship where Captain Vere is captain. And you, just to give you the heads up, you'll be encountering another one of the major characters in the next chapter. For next week, and I will post this, chapters 8 through 14. Okay, that's pages 27 to 48 in the book if you bought the one that I ordered. Okay, so please do have that read as carefully as you can for next week, because that's going to be the last class we have before your exam. And remember, on your exam, you are responsible for everything that has been assigned in terms of the reading. So you are responsible for the first 14 chapters of Billy Budd for that midterm. Okay?
I just have a question about the exam. It's on like 2 classes from now, right? Like based on the course outline.
2 weeks
so like
from today.
So October 22nd?
No, that
No,
would,
not then. No, that would be like,
that would be
yeah.
like a month. No,
Yeah.
October 7th.
Okay, October 7th. Okay, thank you.
This should be available. I'll post this for you guys, but you should be able to access it through your portal. Our exam is scheduled for October 7th between 8 and 12. Right? Nice 4 hours. Okay? And what you should anticipate on that exam, you will have an essay question. I may give you two, you choose one, and you should anticipate that there will be a couple of passages at least, either from Kafka or from Melville, that I'll ask you to analyze in the way that I asked you to do it in that assignment I sent you, and the way that we're doing it here in class. That's why I emphasize the importance of being attentive in class in terms to see how you parse a paragraph, not just the paragraph, but also at the same time relating it to the broader themes, albeit with Billy Budd, the limited themes that we've encountered, because we haven't finished it, but to tie it in with the things that we're discussing in class. Okay? Now, I want to show you, and what I'm about to show you, I will be posting. Ooh, where is it? Darn, darn, darn.
Sir, are you going to be correcting the bonus assignment?
The bonus assignment, yeah, well, because you just receiving them all recently. Yeah, of course. I'll try to have them for you for next week. I am working on, by the way, because one of the big issues is how do I get them back to you? I can't come into class and call out your names and give you back your opinion. But I had a colleague who was, and we made good progress, showing me a way that I can actually return it directly to your emails through the assignment portal. So I'm working on that. We'll hopefully have mastered that by the end of this week, and then when I finish marking yours, I'll return them that way. Otherwise, all I can do is give you a grade, and that's really not going to be helpful in preparing you for the exam. Okay, so fingers crossed that I can get that mastered. And yeah, of course, I'll be going to remember it's a bonus one, so I will put a mark on it, but it's mainly so you can see if you're approaching this type of exercise well. Okay. Bear with me. I have to call up. I thought I had. It should be readily available. All right, so I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to go through it fairly briefly. As I said, this should be review for most of you. You've taken English classes before, but it's just to make it a clear reminder of what I'm looking for in terms of your essays. Everyone sees this? And I think you've gathered, we're not going to have an exercise today, right? I'm going to finish up with this. 5-paragraph essay outline. Yes, I still want you to follow the 5-paragraph. Keeping in mind, most importantly, your exit exam, they will be looking for the 5-paragraph essay. All right. So for now, and then we'll see when it gets to the final, maybe we can talk about breaking out of those restrictions of the 5-paragraph essay, but I want to see the 5-paragraph essay for your midterm in the essay question. Again, very quickly, and I'll be posting this, you can look at it in detail yourself. Remember, in the introduction, most important thing is the thesis statement. thesis statement is a statement that is argumentative. It is not a statement of fact. Okay, I explain this because we have all this here with the thesis statement. Again, I don't want to go over it because it's repetitive. You should have been doing this in the last 2 English classes you did. If you had me, I know you did. And if you had someone else, I'm sure you did on some level. Okay.
If you have a specific question, can I make a like office hour with you? Make an appointment for
Yeah, for the office hours, remember my office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 3. If you can't make it during that time, if you want to make it during that time, you have to email me so we can, because I have others, so I have to fit you in. I usually can, fit you in for like 15 minutes. If you can't make it during that time, just email me and we'll look at our schedules together and find another time. Okay, but it all starts by, sending me an email through Mail. And we'll find a time. And I encourage you all to. Okay. So again, briefly, and you can certainly, if you want after this, because we're going to wrap this up in 10 minutes, if you want to talk about this, the essay structure, make an appointment with me. And I'll go through it with you in detail. Okay. But again, the ever-present, absolutely necessary thesis statement. Remember, the thesis statement, I can't emphasize it enough. It needs to be argumentative. You are taking a position. The prompt I'll give you for the essay will lend itself to that. Okay, Billy Budd is the story of a sailor named Billy Budd. It's not a thesis statement, it's a statement of fact. And a very simplistic one at that. Okay, but a thesis statement is not a statement of fact. Billy Budd represents God and Jesus Christ in terms of elements of sacrifice, redemption, and sartorially, I won't go there. You understand what I'm saying? That is argumentative. The way you test it, can someone disagree with you? If you say Billy Budd is about the story of a sailor named Billy Budd, I can't argue against that. If I say that Billy Budd represents Jesus Christ in this story, yeah, that's arguable. And then what you would set out to do is to prove your argument by using evidence from the text. Sorry? Well, let me just finish. Not evidence from your personal experiences. Every claim you make must be substantiated with evidence from the text, and that means quotes. You will have you will be allowed to bring your books into the exam. You can bring your notes into the exam. I have no problem with that. Be careful with the notes, though, because you can end up wasting a lot of time trying to find something you thought you wrote on a page of your notes. But evidence substantiated by textual material, not personal experiences. It's not a blog. It's an academic essay. Yes, Karen, you had a question.
Yes, are we allowed to include counter arguments as well?
Yeah, I mean, you can. You got to. Great question. You certainly should anticipate counter arguments, but given that it's pressure cooker exam time, it's much harder to develop. You could include one paragraph dealing with the counter arguments. I'm not sure that's going to serve you best when you have a limited amount of time, right? Because you have to justify why you're addressing those counter arguments if you're doing it in an extensive way. If you want to bring in a counter argument just in terms that it's going to strengthen your major argument within individual body paragraphs, you can. It's a very good approach, but it is tricky in a 4-hour pressure cooker. It's a great approach when you have a week or two to write an essay. But absolutely, I mean, it's for you, but you want to, and again, it's also tough in a 5-paragraph structure. Because chances are you'd have to maybe dedicate a whole paragraph to that, and will that fit with your proving of your position. So the emphasis is to make clear what your position is in the thesis statement, and then to support it with examples, supporting details and reasons, or example, approximately 3 in each paragraph. That's just guidelines. It's not written in stone. But when it comes to those counter arguments, and I think this is really important, Karen, what you're saying, is you want to anticipate them, because then you can address them through emphasizing certain vital points in your argument that will in itself address those counter arguments. But anticipating the counter arguments is always, always vital. Okay? Does that help? Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Great question. Love it. Keep in mind as well, topic sentences. As the thesis statement is the foundation of your whole essay. Everything you write in your essay must be relatable to the position you are taking in your thesis statement. And everything in each individual paragraph must relate specifically to the topic sentence. It helps keep you grounded and focused. If you're bringing in material here that does not correspond with your topic sentence, then you have to make sure, you have to reassess it, and chances are that material would need a paragraph of its own. And that could be one of these 2 paragraphs, or you may have to omit it altogether. Remember, the general idea is you're going to have 3 main points that you are going to discuss using examples from the text that will substantiate and confirm and argue for your thesis statement. But that thesis statement may lend itself to 10 main points. You have to eliminate 7 of them. And you have to be careful they don't drift in, because that will impact the unity of what you're writing. You've got to get it down to a manageable 3. It's a 4-hour exam. You'll have time. You'll have that 15 minutes to half an hour to do a mini outline. Think before you write. Okay? Can't emphasize that enough. I'll bring it up again next week before the exam. Think before you write. Most people in exams, they just start writing, and there's a tremendous lack of unity. The beginning is all over the place. Okay? Take the time.
The midterm exam will be just like the final.
The midterm will, both the midterm and the final exam, you're guaranteed to have an essay question. Both of them you should anticipate you'll also have a passage analysis to do. Okay? But the one thing I can guarantee you, how many passage analyses or whatever, what I can guarantee is you will have an essay question. And then what I add to that, I'm still deciding. Okay? That's why this document is so important. Okay?
Final will be not on the novel.
Sorry?
Final exam will not be on the novel.
The final exam. The final exam you will be responsible for everything that we've covered in the second half after the midterm. Okay, so for the midterm exam, you're responsible for the Metamorphosis in its entirety and the first 14 chapters of Billy Budd. In the final exam, you're responsible for everything we've covered for the entire course. You're responsible for the Metamorphosis, Billy Budd, and James Joyce. Okay? I'll remind you of that, obviously, long before we do the final exam.
Sir?
Yeah.
When quoting a specific thing from a novel, do you prefer it after the quote for us to write the name of the author and then the page number?
Yeah, whatever way you're comfortable with, especially because it's an exam, right? If it was a take-home exam, you had time, I'd expect the proper works cited. For this case, no, you can just give me the book and the page number. All right, I'm not going to be marking you on how well you do your citations. I just need to know where they are so I can track them down when I'm marking. And of course, you have the responsibility of indicating where it is. But any way that you want, as long as it's clear and be consistent. If you're going to do it one way, do it that way for all your quotes. Don't mix it up, because that'll just get me all crazy. Okay?
Excuse me, sir, I have a question.
Yes.
It's gonna be on the 2 books we read, the belly.
The midterm will be on the Metamorphosis in its entirety, because we finished it, and only the first 14 chapters of Billy Budd, because that's all we will have read before the exam.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you questions, and even though I could tell you, okay, you have to read the next 7 chapters for the week leading up to the exam, I'm not going to ask you questions on anything we haven't gone over together in class.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I'm going to wrap it up here. This is, again, more details about the, please, if you're not sure about what expectations I have regarding a thesis statement, read this. If there's one area I am very diligent about, it's the thesis statement, because if you have the thesis statement, everything else flows. If you don't have the thesis statement, then everything can fall apart. All right, and if you have questions about it, make an appointment with me, and if you have some, you can bring them up next week, our last week before the exam, and I will address them. Okay, but and you know, this is, I think, mainly goes to those who have not had me before. If you didn't get this amount of information regarding what a thesis statement is. Okay. Yes, this document will be posted. I'll be posting it. I have a class directly after this one, so if I don't get it up to you now, you'll have it tonight. Okay, absolutely, this will be posted. And keep your eye on postings. I may find a few other things to throw up there in preparation for the exam. Okay, but this will be posted later today or tonight at some point. Okay, and there it is. Okay, so we can wrap it up now. Remember, please, it's important because you're responsible for it on your midterm. Read through chapter 14. All right, and we'll pick this up then. Contact me if you want to meet at any time before then, and we'll work that out. And don't worry, I will talk more about the exam next week and get you all prepared. Good. All right. Then we will see you next week, if not sooner, and we'll take it from there.